They didn't have stamps, no postal codes, not even paper. But still, somehow the ancient world managed to whisper across deserts, mountains, and seas. A king wanted to know if his enemy was moving troops. A merchant needed to hear if the trade route was clear. A priest waited for a sign from the gods, and sometimes that sign came by messenger, dusty and panting, under the scorching sun. These were cuneiform tablets, small and square, hardened in the sun. When a ruler of Lagash wanted to send orders to Umma, it wasn't spoken. It was etched into earth and handed to a runner. In the time before empires rose or fell, there were messages quietly carried on clay, stone, or skin. The first mail system wasn't born from bureaucracy. It was born from fear. It's the oldest story of all, the need to communicate when distance gets in the way. Long before we had ink, the Sumerians had something better: mud. In the land between the rivers, ancient Mesopotamia messages were pressed into wet clay using reeds, not for the sender, not for the receiver, but for the courier himself. The message was sacred, its safe arrival a matter of honor. Military dispatches were sent from the front lines to the palace. The army needed supplies, and the king needed news. Imagine mounted couriers stationed at regular intervals across an empire that stretched from modern-day Turkey to India. The messengers moved in relays, handing off dispatches like runners in a marathon that never ended. Sound familiar? The US Postal Service borrowed that line thousands of years later. Messages flew across the empire faster than any army could march. Some letters traveled 1,700 miles in 7 days. That's faster than some modern mail. The roads, the riders, they were the property of the great king. To interfere with them was treason. The message arrived in time to prevent a riot. Thousands were saved, and all because a courier galloped through the night, ignoring sleep, hunger, and danger. Trained in speed, direction, even survival. They knew where to find fresh water in the driest deserts, how to hide scrolls in their clothing, how to vanish into trees if followed. To rule, you had to reach, and to reach, you needed messengers. Ashoka, after converting to Buddhism, sent not only political orders but religious edicts. These were carved into stone pillars and placed across his empire. But for more sensitive messages, runners were dispatched. He would tuck it under his arm and begin the journey on foot, most likely, because wheels were rare and dangerous over rough terrain. In certain regions, messages were even carried by trained birds or by runners with calligraphy-laced scrolls, strapped to their backs. If a letter left the capital at dawn, it might not reach a distant province for weeks. If he was caught or killed, the message might never arrive. Clay letters have been found between traders, even complaints about donkeys. In 1750 BCE, a Babylonian customer wrote to a copper merchant, "You have treated me with contempt." These were formalized with relay stations and horse changes, just like in Persia. But China's geography made things even more complex. Mountains, rivers, dense forests each demanded a different kind of courier. "I will exercise against you my right of rejection." The tone was as dry as the desert it crossed. But if he made it, the recipient would read the baked slab like we read emails. And this wasn't just for kings. And in the age of the pharaohs, messengers weren't just runners, they were witnesses. Trusted eyes and ears, selected carefully, trained to memorize and report. But what happened when clay wasn't enough in Egypt? They used papyrus, a kind of plant-based paper. But that didn't make delivery any easier. Messages still had to move somehow. One of the oldest written records of message delivery comes from the reign of Thutmose III. Around 1450 BC, the routes were dangerous. Bandits, sunstorms, crocodiles, and worse, failure. Failure to deliver could mean death. In Persia, this idea was taken even further. The Achaemenid Empire, vast, brilliant, terrifying, developed one of the earliest formal postal systems. It was called the Angarium. Herodotus, the Greek historian, said of them, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course. Each station had fresh horses and waiting riders." But this wasn't mail for the people. It was imperial still. The very existence of such a system tells us something important. Communication was power. In the East, a different kind of messenger system was developing. In ancient China, especially under the Zhou, and later the Han dynasties, officials established routes known as the Yichuan system. Some rode horses, others traveled by boat. Yet still, the system worked. In one famous case, an emperor sent a message to a provincial governor ordering the arrest of a corrupt tax official. In India, the Maurya Empire under Ashoka the Great also developed early postal structures. These weren't ordinary men, they were elite. There are legends, though perhaps embellished, of couriers who ran 100 miles in a single day. By the time of the Roman Republic, the idea of organized message delivery had matured into something almost modern. Rome didn't conquer the world with swords alone. It did it with roads, and on those roads moved something far more powerful than any legion: information. At the heart of this movement was the cursus publicus, the Roman state's mail and transport service. It wasn't for love letters. It wasn't for birthday scrolls. It was for empire. Orders, intelligence, warnings, decrees. It was how emperors ruled provinces they'd never see, and how revolts were crushed before they could ignite. The name itself sounds dull, public course, but the reality, it was one of the most advanced logistics systems the world had ever seen. Let's start with the roads. Roman roads weren't just pathways, they were arteries of power, perfectly engineered with layers of stone, gravel, and sand. These roads cut straight across mountains, forests, and deserts. At their peak, over 250,000 miles of Roman roads connected the empire. From the misty Isles of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, every 12 to 15 miles. They stopped at mutations relay stations where horses could be changed. Without a diploma, no one could use the cursus publicus. It wasn't public mail, it was imperial. Every 25 to 30 miles, they reached monchones where couriers could rest, feed, and get official updates. After all, these weren't casual messages, they contained military strategies, tax reports, surveillance on rebellious governors, sometimes even assassination orders. The average citizen walking would cover maybe 15 to 20 miles. Rome's couriers outpaced time itself, but in simple scrolls, handed by tired men who had no idea what was inside. But Vitellius, a general with imperial ambitions of his own, intercepted some of the messages and countered them with his own letters. By the time both sets of messages reached Gaul and Germania, civil war was already brewing. These weren't inns for travelers. They were sacred outposts of the state, stuffed and guarded. A merchant warning of bandits near the Alps. These weren't official messages, but they somehow found passage, smuggled in or granted as favors. And on these roads galloped the cursus Roman couriers. They didn't ride aimlessly. Costs soared. Horses were mistreated. Roads fell into disrepair. The couriers carried diplomas, official bronze or papyrus documents, granting them access to the system. Reforms tried to fix it. Diocletian and later Constantine cut back privileges, reorganized stations, but the golden age of Rome's postal might was already fading. Broken, overgrown, used by bandits instead of couriers. And it was fast. No GPS, no map apps, just sheer precision and manpower. The roads carried grain, goods and gossip. All roads led to Rome. Yes, but they also led from it. Ideas. Language. Law. All spread, sealed in scrolls and tied to saddlebags. With relays and fresh horses, a dispatch could travel over 100 miles in a single day, almost unthinkable for the time. One preserved letter from a Roman governor in Britannia to the Emperor Hadrian made it to Rome. In less than 5 days across rough terrain, channel crossings and multiple provinces. But it wasn't just speed, it was security. Messages were often sealed with wax and stamped with the sender's signet ring. Breaking the seal was a crime. Intercepting or impersonating a courier could mean death. In one chilling example, Emperor Domitian reportedly used the postal service to issue quiet execution notices delivered not. With drama, even emperors lived or died by the mail. When Galba took the throne after Nero's suicide in 68 CE, he sent word to the provinces via the cursus publicus. Mail became a weapon. But there was also beauty in the system. We have fragments of friendly letters sent via private adaptations of the public system. A soldier writing to his brother, a woman begging her husband to come home. And for Rome, even the movement of these whispers reinforced control. Over time, though, the system began to crack. The empire grew too large. Corruption seeped in. Local officials misused the system, sending personal letters on imperial horses, turning relay stations into drinking dens. By the 4th century, the once legendary cursus publicus had become bloated and slow. And when the Western Empire fell, in 476 CE, so did the heartbeat of its messages. The roads remained, but for centuries, what Rome had built remained unmatched. It would take another 1,000 years for Europe to recreate anything like it. The Western Roman Empire may have collapsed in fire and ruin, but in the East, its soul survived, reborn in marble and mosaics, cloaked in incense and empire. Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, where emperors still ruled, where Christ reigned from golden domes, and where messages still moved. But not like before. The Byzantines didn't just inherit Rome's postal system. They were no longer just riders. They were witnesses, spies, priests, even eunuchs. They transformed it into something quieter, more secretive, more religious, and more paranoid. But in imperial records, we find mention of the cursus velox, the swift course, a revived system of fast riders for urgent state matters. After all, this was an empire constantly under siege, not just by armies, but by conspiracies, heresies, and ghosts of the past. The ancient roads were still there, some patched, others buried. But now the message mattered more than the journey. And the messengers? Fires lit atop towers could signal danger along the borders. Silent flames dancing through the night, carrying a message of invasion or treachery. A chain of lights could send warnings from the Armenian frontier all the way back to the capital. In mere hours, wars against the Goths, Vandals, and Persians meant information had to move fast, and they were wrapped in parchment, sealed with wax or lead, and stamped with the emblem of the emperor, or sometimes with the sacred image of Christ Pantocrator. To tamper with the seal was to defy both throne and heaven. Messages weren't just about wars or taxes, they were tools of intrigue. Arrest orders, exile decrees, death sentences, all written with elegance and finality. His messages often never touched the public system. They were hand-delivered by men whose names were never recorded, men whose loyalty was absolute, or whose tongues were cut out. The messengers who brought these letters were cursed by the faithful and protected by soldiers. Letter became a weapon of theology. The Byzantine courier network didn't have a single name like the cursus publicus. It evolved over centuries, often quietly. Messages took longer, and fewer people could be trusted to carry them. The once vast relay network of Rome had shrunk to narrow, twisting lines barely held together by tradition. Others enclosed relics, fragments of saints, bones or splinters of the true cross. These weren't just communications. They were holy acts moving from bishop to bishop, emperor to patriarch, bound in silk and reverence. They were the veins of the state, pulsing with intelligence and imperial will. These were common during times of theological dispute or civil unrest. It was a silence that fell over one of the oldest message networks in history. In a world where the wrong word could spark a riot, secrecy was everything. The scrolls crumbled. The towers went dark. The messages they carried were often written in Greek, not Latin. The empire had shifted culturally and linguistically. By the 6th century, under the rule of Justinian I, the Byzantine state saw the value of fast communication in a dangerous world. Justinian's generals, like the brilliant Belisarius, received orders from Constantinople that had crossed hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. Some messages were so sensitive they were memorized, not written. A messenger could be tortured, paper could be stolen, but a trained mind? That was harder to crack. The Byzantines also used a network of beacon towers to relay simple messages, an innovation borrowed and adapted from older Roman warning systems. Imagine a flicker on a distant hill, then another, then another. But the most feared messages were the ones sent within the palace. The Byzantine court was a place of whispers and silk where every step could echo with betrayal. One emperor, Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, used a private network of trusted couriers to bypass official channels. Even religious correspondence was loaded with danger. In the iconoclast controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries, letters from Constantinople forbade the veneration of icons. Monks who resisted were imprisoned, and yet in the chaos, beauty still emerged. Some Byzantine letters were illuminated with gold leaf. There were even coded messages, subtle shifts in wording or acrostics, or hidden meanings known only to the sender and reader. But as the centuries passed, the system, like the empire itself, grew brittle. The Arab conquests severed key routes in the east. The Slavic incursions disrupted paths in the Balkans. Trade slowed. Roads decayed. By the time of the Crusades, Western knights were astonished to see messages still moving across Byzantium, but they mocked their slowness, not knowing the burden those scrolls carried. One Latin chronicler wrote, "Their parchment is fine, their writers devout, but their words arrive long after the danger has passed." Yet the Byzantines endured. For 1,000 years after Rome fell, they maintained the heartbeat of imperial communication, however faint, however fragile. And when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, it wasn't just an empire that died. The roads turned to dust, but in libraries in ruins. In fragments, we still find them, the echoes of voices that crossed an empire. They say when Genghis Khan wanted someone dead, they died. When he wanted someone found, they were found. And when he sent a message across the wind-blown steppe, it arrived before the next sunrise. This wasn't magic. It was the Yaman ancient postal system, forged not in marble halls or palace courts, but on horseback in the wild, in blood. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the banks of the Danube, from frozen Siberia to the burning sands of Persia. And yet, they galloped faster than any soldier, with messages that could change the fate of cities. Relay stations had existed in Persia, in China, in Rome. But the Mongols perfected it. They turned it into something terrifyingly efficient. But it wasn't held together by swords alone. It was held by a silent army of couriers. They didn't wear armor. They carried no banners. The Yam system was the lifeline of the Mongol state. A network of relay stations, mounted riders, and secret paths that pulsed across continents. The idea wasn't new. The Yam system carried tax records, census reports, trade orders, and diplomatic correspondence. He wrote of how the great Khan's messages could move as swiftly as demons ride the wind. It allowed Mongol rulers to govern vast, diverse lands from the Buddhist temples of Tibet to the Orthodox cathedrals of Russia. There were thousands of stations called Urchu spaced roughly every 25 to 30 miles. At each one, fresh horses waited, fed and ready. They could ride day and night with no tents, no luxuries, and often no sleep. They learned to sleep in the saddle, holding the reins in their fists. All were trained to ride without rest, to cross rivers without bridges, and to survive with nothing but a knife, a bow, and a strip of dried meat. The messages could be folded into cloth, tied to belts, or hidden inside saddlebags. The most urgent ones were marked with seals of the Jurija metal medallion, granting the rider absolute authority and access. Riders had to present the correct Jurij or spoken token to move through restricted areas. This added a layer of security that few other ancient systems had. The Mongols, known for their ruthlessness in war, were surprisingly inclusive when it came to communication. But because of the Yam, merchants could send letters ahead. Caravans could warn each other of dangers. Foreign dignitaries could correspond safely across thousands of miles. Messages could be in Persian, Chinese, Arabic, or even Russian. Local scribes were employed at stations. Local rulers began charging tolls. Corruption crept in. Horses disappeared. Stations were abandoned. The once glorious pulse of the empire slowed. Translators worked full-time in the Koghan's court. A courier could ride in, switch horses, drink water, eat dried meat or milk curds, and be gone again in minutes. An echo of hooves, a ghost of a message that once galloped faster than time. With this system, a message could travel over 100 miles in a single day. If a message was intercepted, it was copied, translated, and studied. Sometimes, it was even forged and sent onward to spread misinformation or chaos, and this was in the 13th century. The couriers themselves were chosen for their endurance and loyalty. Many were soldiers, some were nobles. They carried messages written in Uyghur script or classical Mongolian, often dictated directly by the Khan. If a village refused to provide horses or food to a courier carrying a jurij, that village could be burned to the ground. The Mongol state took communication very seriously, and it wasn't just military. One of the most astonishing accounts of this system comes from the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who described the Yam as a miracle of organization. He wasn't exaggerating. In fact, some Mongol riders trained with 2 horses at once, switching mid-ride to prevent exhaustion. The Mongols even developed a rudimentary form of passcode clearance. Only certain messengers could access certain stations. It wasn't just fast, it was smart. But what's even more extraordinary is how tolerant the system was. The message mattered more than the language, and this unity through communication had a profound effect. Trade routes like the Silk Road flourished under Mongol control, not because of peace alone. Even spies used the Yam. Genghis Khan himself was known to read enemy letters captured in battle. In war, the Yam became a weapon. But nothing lasts forever. As the Mongol Empire fractured in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Yam weakened. Civil wars disrupted routes. By the time the Ming dynasty rose in China, much of the old Mongol infrastructure had crumbled into dust. Still, the idea remained, and in places, fragments of the yam survived for centuries. Even today, in the open steppes of Mongolia, nomadic horsemen ride paths once traced by Genghis Khan's couriers. Sometimes, the wind carries a whisper. In the stillness of the desert night, beneath crescent moons and minarets, something moved. It wasn't a caravan. It wasn't a trader. It was a man on horseback, traveling swiftly, wrapped in silence and duty, carrying not gold or silk but paper and ink, bearing the voice of the Caliph. In the Islamic Golden Age, while Europe slumbered in feudal chaos, the Islamic world was writing. More than a mail service, it was a lifeline of the Islamic Empire. It connected cities across scorching deserts, soaring mountains, and winding rivers from Cordoba to Baghdad, from Cairo to Samarkand, a place of scholars and scribes, poets and astronomers, all held together by a state that believed deeply in the importance of written communication, thinking, translating, teaching, and communicating across distances once considered impassable. But how did those ideas travel? Enter the postal system of the Caliphate. Their job, not just to deliver letters, but to observe, record, and report. Was the local governor behaving? Was there unrest? Were the markets stable? Unlike the Romans or Byzantines who used parchment, or the Egyptians with papyrus, the Islamic world adopted paper for its flexibility and affordability. Scientific theories could move, medicine, philosophy, trade agreements, love, and with paper the possibilities expanded. The postal system was also a surveillance system. A few included miniature illuminations, tiny drawings, astrological symbols, or geometric patterns. A message wasn't just a transmission, it was a work of devotion, and they could fly over mountains, bypassing the dangers of the road. And it didn't just carry words, it carried power. A pigeon could only fly back to where it had been raised. So, pigeons were kept at key stations ready for one-way messages, and received hundreds of letters each year between scholars, translators, and patrons across the empire. In Andalusia, under Muslim rule, mail moved between cities that would later fall under Christian kings. The knowledge, however, stayed. These posts were known as Kanz or Rabats, and they were more than just mail stops. They were listening posts. They could ride day and night through sandstorms, across rivers, even through battle fields, each one a tiny voice from an empire that believed that truth, law, and love should always travel. Couriers began using pigeons. In some areas, birds trained to return to specific towers, carrying tiny messages tied to their legs. Some traveled with guards, others rode alone, cloaked, carrying scrolls wrapped in waxed leather to protect them from the elements. The bard was first established under the Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th century, but it flourished under the Abbasids, whose capital Baghdad was one of the greatest cities the world had ever known. One tale tells of a messenger from Baghdad who arrived in Damascus 3 days after his dispatch. His horse collapsed beneath him and his lips cracked with thirst, but the scroll, unharmed, still sealed. And knowledge required messengers. Letters were sent ahead to ensure supplies, safety, and protection for travelers to Mecca. The logistics were astounding, especially when you consider the distances and conditions. The caliphs understood something crucial: rule through knowledge. The bard was highly organized. Relay stations were built every 12 to 15 miles, stocked with horses, water, fodder, and shelter. Each station had officials called bard agents. Every message carried through the bard was a thread in a web that stretched across the Islamic world. The mail itself was typically written in Arabic, often in the stunning, artistic script of the Abbasid court. Letters were composed by professional scribes, often adorned with religious phrases like Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Paper and innovation learned from the Chinese had become common by the 9th century. Poetry could travel. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, one of the greatest intellectual institutions of its time, sent. Some of these letters were sealed with wax. Others were tied in silk. The Caliph's orders, however, were always marked with his Tughra stylized calligraphic signature. No document could be considered authentic without it. The bard was respected and feared. The couriers had the authority to override local leaders, seize horses, and demand food. Refusing them was treason. There are stories, half history, half legend, of couriers who crossed entire provinces in a single day during the height of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th and 10th centuries. The bard was used not only for political control but for the coordination of pilgrimages. Later, under the Fatimids and Mamluks, the system adapted again. Egypt became a hub of postal activity. These messenger pigeons were fast, sometimes faster than horses, but they were limited. The Mongols would later use pigeons too, but the Islamic world had mastered them centuries earlier. As the centuries passed, the bard continued, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, depending on the ruler and the stability of the empire. But the principle remained: messages mattered. Even as the caliphate fractured, the idea of a connected world through letters survived. When Europeans began developing their own postal systems in the Renaissance, they were often inspired, directly or indirectly, by what the Islamic world had done. Today, buried in old libraries, hidden in forgotten archives, lie thousands of these letters, folded, yellowed, silent, long before trains rattled through the Indian subcontinent. Before post boxes stood on dusty corners, there were other ways messages moved, quieter, older ways. In ancient India, letters didn't always travel by paper. Sometimes they moved by memory, sometimes by foot, sometimes tucked into the feathers of a bird, and always they moved with purpose across jungles and deserts, rivers and ridges carried by runners, riders, and silence itself. His grandson, Ashoka the Great, ruled over nearly all of the Indian subcontinent, from the Himalayas to the southern tip of the Deccan. And like all rulers of vast lands, he needed to speak across distance, time, and difference. These weren't letters meant for a single man. They were meant for entire cities. Some still stand today, their messages weathered but legible. Orders to live peacefully, warnings against cruelty, instructions to respect animals, parents, monks. This is the story of how an ancient civilization, rich in poetry and mathematics, faith and philosophy, wove communication into its empire. It begins with the Mauryan Empire, founded around 321 BCE by Chandragupta Maurya. There were foot messengers, fleet runners who could navigate narrow trails through forests and hills. Sometimes they were hidden inside hollow rings or sewn into clothing. That same discipline extended to messengers. If a message was especially sensitive, it might be memorized, recited word for word by a messenger trained in retention. In a time when writing was sacred and sometimes suspect memory was the safest, on Valope there were horse couriers, reserved for long distance or urgent messages. These weren't just couriers, they were part of the emotional machinery of storytelling. Scholars exchanged letters on science, astronomy, and medicine. Poets and lovers composed verses in Sanskrit, delivered across regions by foot messengers called dutas. And there were even spies disguised as couriers, who carried hidden letters or false messages to confuse enemy states. Ashoka's messages weren't whispered, they were carved into stone. Couriers were paid by the mile. They had official uniforms, and in major cities, there were designated postal hubs called Dagchaukas, literal message checkpoints. This ancient text, sometimes compared to Machiavelli's The Prince, lays out guidelines for everything from taxation to war and mail. Messages moved through a relay system using horsemen, runners, and even pigeons. A message carried by wind or wings was more than a note. It was a prayer, a wish, a whisper from afar. Yes, trained homing pigeons, kept in towers across northern India, carried one-way dispatches in small silver or leather tubes tied to their legs. Rival kingdoms often bribed messengers to intercept or delay enemy letters. Only the intended recipient knew which ingredient meant attack and which meant wait. Messages were sometimes encoded with riddles, metaphors, or even mathematical puzzles meant to confuse those who stole them. All across India, stone pillars were etched with edicts in Prakrit and Sanskrit, written in the Brahmi script. These runners wore bells, so they could be heard approaching a post station even in thick jungle. Fresh messengers waited at intervals, ready to carry the message forward day or night, rain or fire. But for personal messages, political dispatches, and urgent decisions, something faster was needed. So the Mauryans created something remarkable, an early state-run courier system. We know this from the Arthashastra, an ancient Indian treatise on politics, espionage, and governance, attributed to Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, the advisor to Chandragupta. In it, couriers are described in detail, their ranks, their duties, their pay. Messages were written on birch bark, palm leaves, or cloth, folded and sealed with colored thread or wax. In fact, the oral tradition in India was so strong that for centuries before writing was common, entire epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana were passed down not through scrolls, but through memory. A skilled courier could recall a full message delivered with exact phrasing, rhythm, and even tone. Later Indian empires expanded the network. The Gupta Empire c. 320 to 550 CE, often seen as a golden age of Indian culture, supported a flourishing message system. In classical Sanskrit drama, the Duta or messenger was a literary archetype, a character who carried words of longing between lovers, news between kings, or secrets between gods. But in real life, they were essential to running the state. A famous inscription from the reign of Harsha, 7th century CE, mentions a chain of couriers spanning the empire. The mules, much later, would expand this further. Under Akbar the Great in the 16th century, a remarkably advanced postal network was created. Akbar's court kept meticulous records of postal costs, delivery times, and even the weight of messages. Even poets praised them. In mule poetry, the pigeon and runner were symbols of longing. But not all messages were noble. Espionage was deeply embedded in the courier system. One preserved letter from a Rajput court was disguised as a recipe. By the 18th century, as colonial powers arrived, the indigenous systems began to be absorbed or replaced. But traces of the old methods lingered. Even today, the word dak, meaning mail, is still used in India, a relic of the mule and pre-mule courier systems. And if you ever walk through a remote village and hear a distant bell at night, perhaps it's nothing, or perhaps it's a whisper from 1,000 years ago, still running through the trees. In the heart of the Forbidden City, behind walls of lacquered red and golden tile, the Son of Heaven sat in silence. His face was hidden behind veils of silk, his voice rarely heard by common men, and yet, with a flick of his brush, his words could travel 1,000 miles. This was ancient China, and beyond, China maintained one of the most sophisticated courier networks in the ancient world. But the true system began with the Qin dynasty to 21 to 106 BCE. Under the ruthless rule of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, it wasn't just about speed, it was about structure, hierarchy and ritual. Because in China, even a letter was a symbol of order, and its mail system was nothing short of imperial magic. For over 2,000 years, from the early Zhou dynasty through the Qin, Han, Tang, the earliest traces of formal communication come from the Zhou dynasty c. 1046 to 256 BCE, where bronze inscriptions and bamboo slips carried messages between noble houses, a blend of courier, caravan and careful silence, and all official messages had to bear the imperial seal of dragon etched into jade or bronze, pressed into red wax or stamped ink. At its peak, the Tang maintained over 1,600 post stations across the empire. Messages could travel up to 300 miles a day using relay horses. Special couriers known as Zhongquan Ren carried imperial edicts, sealed with vermilion ink, often guarded by soldiers. It stretched like a web from the capital outward, touching towns, provinces, garrisons and borders. These small, official plaques were issued by the court. A 3-stick letter meant immediate delivery. No rest, no delay, and sometimes no return. Long scrolls of silk or mulberry paper, brushed with calligraphy so elegant that some couriers reportedly wept upon reading the words. Not from emotion, but from beauty. The brush stroke was a reflection of the emperor's will. Any smudge, tear, or alteration was punished. Without one, you could not use the imperial network. Even high-ranking officials needed special permission. Every 30 to 40 li, about 10 to 13 miles, there was a relay station a liaison. Poets wrote to each other. Scholars debated philosophy across cities. Buddhist monks sent handwritten sutras to distant temples. By the end of the Qing dynasty in the 19th century, foreign mail systems, British, French, Russian, began to replace the old ways. In one famous example, the poet Du Fu, writing from the war-torn frontier, sent letters home wrapped in scraps of cloth carried by passing traders or loyal soldiers. And in museums behind glass lie scrolls once carried by trembling hands, letters that moved an empire, one hoofbeat at a time. These were staffed with hostlers, cooks, guards and officials. Horses were stabled, food was prepared, and scrolls were received with reverence. He didn't just unify walls and weights, he unified communication. Under his rule, roads were widened, relay stations were built, messengers were ranked. Some emperors, especially during the Ming dynasty, kept shadow agents to follow postal routes and report abuse. His mission: to open up diplomatic ties with distant lands and report back. He was gone for over a decade, but when he returned, the scrolls he brought changed Chinese foreign policy for generations. With the rise of the Silk Road, messages weren't just moving inside the empire, they were carried as far west as Persia, even Rome. Diplomatic letters, trade agreements, and secret negotiations rode alongside caravans of jade, silk, and spice. The system was called the Yichuan, literally post-relay. The Han dynasty to 106 BC to 20 CE expanded the system dramatically. One of the most famous Chinese envoys, Zhang Jin, traveled across Central Asia in the 2nd century BCE. And the method? By the Tang dynasty 618 to 907 CE, the relay system had reached its golden age. Only those with golden credentials called Pai could access the fastest lanes. Some messages were sent with incense, small sticks burned to indicate urgency. The documents themselves were works of art, but not all messages were official. Private letters moved too, often piggybacking on the imperial lines. These informal messages might not have passed through the official liaison. but they followed the same roads under the same sky, and beneath it all, there was always fear. For couriers, delay could mean death, horses were tracked, arrival times recorded. A missing scroll might be taken as treason. There were even tales half myth, half memory of couriers who rode until their hands froze to the reins, who collapsed at the gates of distant cities. Scrolls still clutched in a lifeless grip, because in China, the message wasn't just important, it was sacred. But even sacred things fade. As dynasties rose and fell, the system waxed and waned. Wars broke roads, bandits burned stations. Corruption gnawed at the edges, yet traces remain. Ancient post roads still wind through mountain passes. Weathered stone markers sit forgotten in bamboo groves. High in the Andes, above the clouds, where the air thins and the mountains stretch like the bones of the earth, an empire once pulsed with silent messages. No wheels, no paper, no alphabet, no horses, and yet the Inca built one of the fastest, most efficient courier systems the world has ever known. It was called the Chasqui system, and it was not made of metal or ink, but of men-Quis-fleet-footed messengers trained from childhood to run. They carried no weapons, only quipus, shell horns, and the words of emperors woven into memory and breath. The Inca Empire, at its height in the 15th century, stretched over 2,500 miles. From what is now Colombia in the north to Chile in the south, it covered rugged mountains, deserts, jungles, and coastlines. But unlike other empires, the Inca didn't use horses, they didn't have them, nor did they invent writing as we know it. Instead, they used quipu. A quipu wasn't a scroll or tablet. It was a system of knotted cords, long threads, made of cotton or alpaca wool, dyed in different colors and knotted in specific ways. If a chasqui forgot a detail, it could mean disaster. No knots, no scrolls, only breath. So they trained as children, reciting messages over and over, until the rhythm of words became instinct. They wore bright tunics, carried silver quipus, and were guarded at every stop. They didn't just deliver information, they moved policy, power, fear. Francisco Pizarro's men, dragging cannons and horses up mountain trails, couldn't understand how messages moved faster than they did. Each knot represented numbers or categories: population, harvest yields, tax quotas, military units. At every tambo, a fresh chasqui waited. Along cliffs, they run across rope bridges hand-woven from grass fibers, swinging high above ravines. To this day, those bridges are rebuilt every year by descendants of the Inca, just as they were centuries ago. Most lie in museums, silent, their meaning still uncertain. We see the knots, we trace the cords. Rope bridges are still woven, hand over hand, across yawning valleys. And when the wind howls through the Andes, it sometimes carries an old rhythm, the ghost footfall of a chasqui, bearing the voice of an emperor tied into string and strung across the sky. But we no longer hear what they said. As soon as one runner arrived, the next took off relay style. No delay. It said the exchange was so swift, the message never stopped moving. Interfering with a runner was punished as a crime against the empire. Some tambos even held offerings, food or feathers placed along the route to bless the journey, declared it pagan and useless. They dismantled the tambos, turned the chasqui into porters. The roads remained, but the messages stopped. But beyond math, some scholars believe the quipu may have carried narrative meaning to stories, histories, even poetry encoded in a visual and tactile language we still don't fully understand. Over 25,000 miles of stone-paved roads carved into cliff faces through jungles, and over icy passes, the quipu was the message, and the chasqui were the messengers. dressed in light tunics, sandals laced tight and carrying small satchels. The Chasqui ran along the Chapac on the Inca road system, at intervals of about 1.5 miles. There were small outposts, called tambos, rest stations with food, water and shelter. With this system, a message from Cusco, the imperial capital, could reach Quito over 1,000 miles away in under a week. Some say even faster. No horses, just legs, just lungs, each Chasqui trained for speed, stamina and critically memory. Not every message was a quipu. Some were oral, a verbal report, an imperial command, a warning of rebellion. These were memorized with precision. Some messages were so secret, they were spoken only once. The Inca Sopa, the emperor, was said to have his own personal team of elite Chasqui. The Inca state revolved around movement. Food moved, troops moved, and messages moved more reliably than in many parts of Europe at the time. At mountain crossings, Chasqui blew shell trumpets to alert the next runner. On coastal roads, they used signal fires. But the system was not just practical, it was sacred. The roads themselves were considered holy. Chasqui could not be harmed. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they were stunned. One Spanish chronicler wrote, "The Indians seem to know our intentions before we do." What they didn't know was that the Andes had their own nervous system. The empire was listening, watching, running. But as with all empires, it ended. When the Spanish conquered the Inca in the 1530s, they didn't just kill kings. They broke the quipu system, burned it, mocked it. Today, only a few hundred quipu survive, still. In highland villages, elders remember. Runners still race on festival days. There were no roads, no horses, no wheels, no written language. And yet, across thousands of miles of open ocean, the Polynesians spoke to each other, not with letters carved into stone, not with scrolls wrapped in silk, but with waves, stars, wind, and memory. Their messages rode in. Canoes whispered across island chains, passed not from hand to hand but from generation to generation. This wasn't mail, as we usually understand it. This was deep-sea communication in its most ancient form. These were double-hulled, ocean-going vessels capable of carrying dozens of people, animals, plants and cargo, built with precise tools and sacred rituals. The canoes moved not randomly but along planned routes known to the elders and navigators, or wayfinders. Sometimes they brought gifts, woven mats, feathers, shells, or sacred objects that served as tokens of diplomacy. The Polynesian Triangle stretches from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the southwest and Easter Island in the southeast. They communicated, scattered. Within it are over 1,000 islands, tiny dots of land adrift in the largest ocean on Earth. And yet, the ancient Polynesians voyaged between them. And they didn't just travel. But how? You had to become it. Let's begin with the canoe. Not just a boat, but a lifeline. They used no compass, no charts. Instead, they relied on each journey was a message, a mission. A canoe might carry news of birth or death, requests for help, or even proposals for marriage between distant islands. Sometimes, they brought warnings. But how did the message survive the voyage? They trained from childhood to preserve stories, genealogies, laws, and messages across vast distances. There was no paper, no ink, no letters. Across hundreds, even thousands of miles sometimes. These journeys were part of seasonal cycles with certain winds and currents known to be safe. These weren't carried on voyages, they were studied beforehand, passed down like secrets. Other times, they were emergency missions carried through storms, famine, or threat of war. Instead, messages were carried in memory, spoken, sung, or chanted by designated orators, people whose job it was to remember everything. They performed it often in poetic form with cadence, rhythm, and sacred phrasing. Each word, gesture, and inflection mattered. This tradition of oral transmission wasn't casual. It was ritualized. The messenger didn't just say the message. To this day, scholars debate whether rongo was a full writing system or a mnemonic device, but either way, it helped messages survive when words alone were not enough. You couldn't just paraphrase an order from a chief. Voyaging canoes still crossed the Pacific, without instruments, guided only by wind, wave, and stars, carrying not just crew, but a message from the past. And these messengers didn't sail alone. In many cases, they were accompanied by navigators, priests of the stars, who read the sky like a map. It was about connection, about reminding a distant cousin, an allied chief, or an ancestral land, "We remember you. We are one people." The ocean does not divide us, it binds us. Star paths, memorized sequences of rising and setting stars, wave patterns, the way ocean swells bounced off islands miles away, cloud shapes, formations that hovered over land, bird flights, seabirds that never flew too far from shore. This was navigation as language, a way of listening to the sea. And with it, messages moved. One canoe might take a message from Samoa to Tonga, another from Tahiti to the Marquesas on Easter Island. Oral messengers used a unique form of memory aid. Rongo, a mysterious system of glyphs carved into wooden tablets, and on the atolls of Micronesia, navigators created stick charts, delicate frameworks made of palm and shell, used to record wave patterns, island positions, and sailing routes. Polynesian communication was not fast by modern standards. A message could take weeks to reach its destination, and there was always risk: storms, reef, pirates, or simply getting lost in the vast blue. But for the Polynesians, the act of sending a message was never just about information. European explorers, when they arrived in the Pacific in the 16th and 17th centuries, were stunned to find people already there, people who spoke related languages, shared customs, and knew the names of islands thousands of miles away. They didn't understand that the Polynesians had already built a network, a web of moving knowledge, a sea road without signs. Even today, this system survives. In places like Hawaii and Micronesia, the tradition of wayfinding has been revived. A message that says, "We never stopped listening to the sea." Long before colonial maps carved the African continent into jagged shapes, long before telegraphs crackled across deserts or trains rumbled through savannas, the kingdoms of West and Central Africa had their own way of speaking, not with parchment, not with ink, but with sound in the deep, forests in the open plains, across rivers and hills. Messages moved on rhythm. This is the story of the talking drum, the silent runners, and the voices that once connected empires without a single piece of paper, and later the Mali and Songhai empires, great civilizations that thrived between the 8th and 16th centuries CE, from the Atlantic coast to the edges of the Sahara. And still, the emperor could speak to distant cities in a single day. These empires were rich in gold, culture, and learning, but they were also vast. Messages had to travel far and fast. Let's begin in the heart of medieval West Africa, with the Kingdom of Ghana. In Mali, under Mansa Musa, the empire stretched across 1,000 miles, not with horses, not with pigeons, but with drums. It was a language, the talking drum called by different names in different regions. Like Dundan or a tumpum was not just an instrument. He played a phrase that evoked the idea, the mood, the weight of that announcement. Often, they used praise poetry, long, rhythmic refrains known as Auric in Yoruba or griotic formulas in Mound cultures. The drummer held the instrument under one arm and squeezed to change the pitch, allowing them to imitate the rise and fall of tonal speech. These drums were carved with precision, with hollow wooden bodies and tension cords made of hide. Because many African languages such as Yoruba and Yu are tonal, meaning pitch changes word meaning, the drums could be used to speak, and what they spoke could be understood across miles. One well-trained drummer could send a phrase from a village to a hilltop. Another drummer would hear it, repeat it, and pass it on. They memorized lineages, treaties, wars, and songs. But they also carried verbal messages, committed to memory, to be delivered exactly word for word. The message, sometimes poetic, sometimes political, would be whispered into the griot's ear. Then the griot would travel sometimes by foot, sometimes by horse, sometimes with a caravan and deliver it orally. With the correct tone and structure, a message chain would ripple outward fast, coded, and unmistakable. Reports say messages could travel up to 100 miles in under an hour. Researchers in the 20th century found that messages sent between villages could include names, times, actions, even tone. But it wasn't just words, it was meaning. The drummer didn't say the king is dead. For example, he who wore gold as sandals. The language of the drums was layered with proverbs, codes, and regional dialects. You had to be trained to hear what others missed. Whose words bent the river's course? Raids. Marriages. Deaths. Rainfall. Trade deals. Famine. He went toward the river. Watch the road near the big mango tree. He sleeps now in silence. The networks of oral communication were viewed as primitive despite their elegance and reliability. That meant the king is gone. To outsiders, it sounded like music, but to the people of the land, it was a letter, and these letters were protected. Some griots still recite ancestral messages in moonlit courtyards, and in the rhythm of drumbeats at festivals, one can still feel a faint pulse, the heartbeat of a continent that once spoke without writing. Every royal court employed griots, oral historians, musicians, and messengers trained to carry the memory of the kingdom. When one ruler wished to address another, a griot would be summoned. In many regions, the truth of the message depended on the griot's authority, not the seal on a document. They were living mail, and just like written letters, griot messages could be intercepted, misquoted, or used as political weapons. This made the role dangerous but deeply respected. Further east, in the Congo Basin, drums were even more intricate. Among the local people of the Congo River, large slip drums called ingoma could imitate entire sentences of the Lingala language. One missionary once described a warning about a runaway criminal sent across villages by drum. The message, "Bad man escaped from the chief's house." That's not rumor, that's logistics. Even more fascinating, drum messages were often public. Unlike letters, which are private and sealed, drum messages were heard by everyone, but not everyone understood them. It was like broadcasting a message on a secret channel. Everyone could hear the beat, but only a few could understand the meaning, and so news moved, births, the forest spoke. But with colonization, much of this system was disrupted. European powers insisted on written administration. Drummers were banned or discouraged. Griots were sidelined in favor of colonial scribes. Today, talking drums are mostly used in music and ceremony, but echoes remain. In remote villages, some elders still remember the patterns. In the damp stone halls of a medieval castle, a torch flickers. A hooded rider waits in the courtyard, mud caked on his boots, a scroll sealed in wax gripped tight in his gloved hand. Slowly, unreliably, and often dangerously, He's ridden through rain and blood, past bandits and barons, over crumbling bridges, and he carries not a sword but a message. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, the roads decayed, bridges collapsed, central authority splintered. In medieval Europe, messages moved in the shadows. Unlike the vast systems of Rome that came before, the organized roots of China and the Islamic Caliphate medieval, Europe's communication was fractured, and so mail became a matter of survival. If a king wanted to send an order to a distant duchy, he needed more than a good horse. He needed luck. These letters, called royal writs or charters, were sealed with wax and marked with an official seal, usually bearing the image of a throne, a cross, or a coat of arms. Because in this world, a courier could be robbed, killed, drafted, or simply lost. Without such symbols, they could be mistaken for spies or criminals and executed on the spot. You gave your letter to a traveler, a caravan, a monk, or a pilgrim heading in the right direction. They were written just to express pain, love, or longing, and then burned, buried, or placed in a church alcove. You prayed they were honest. You prayed harder that they were literate. Monks, among the few who could read and write, often carried letters between abbeys, cathedrals, and universities. The church, stretching across borders, became the closest thing medieval Europe had to a mail system. Let's begin with the monarchs. Scholars needed to exchange ideas, manuscripts, and academic notices. So, networks of clerical couriers emerged, riding from city to city, bearing the beginnings of what we might call scholarly mail. Kings and queens maintained small networks of royal messengers, trusted men, often nobles, who carried letters between courts. Contracts, prices, and orders had to move. Wealth depended on it. The messengers themselves wore badges or rings to identify their authority. They traveled on horseback, and when the roads became too muddy, they walked. Some carried horns to signal their approach at castles and cities. Letters might use false names, cryptic language, or cipher wheels, an early form of encryption. A trader might disguise a shipment of weapons as wine barrels. A prince might send a message to a rival under the guise of a merchant's invoice. Others were told to travel only at night to avoid ambush. The Gutenberg press made it possible to reproduce not just books but letters, proclamations, and news bulletins. Literacy spread. So did the appetite for communication. But for now, messages still moved by candlelight, carried in saddlebags, hidden in boots, or whispered in shadow. But even official messages could take weeks, sometimes months to arrive. A letter from London to Rome might pass through a dozen hands, across war-torn lands, through feudal territories, where the local lord demanded a toll. Some were kidnapped. His horse was found. The letter was not. Others bribed. A few simply vanished, or refused passage altogether. No post office, no guarantee that their words would ever arrive. And what about ordinary people? They had no mail service. If you were a merchant, a scholar, or a commoner, you relied on chance. Sometimes, letters were never meant to arrive, but some messages did make it. Monasteries played a crucial role. A letter from an abbot in Paris could reach a monastery in York faster than a message from one castle to another 20 miles away, because the monks had roots, rules, and trust. By the 12th century, things began to change. The rise of universities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford created a new demand for communication. Merchants, too, began forming their own systems in trade hubs like Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League cities. Commercial correspondence was essential. So, traders hired private messengers often. Young apprentices trained to read, write, and carry letters between ports and markets. And sometimes they wrote in code. In a world of political intrigue and shifting alliances, secrecy mattered. By the late Middle Ages in the 14th and 15th centuries, diplomacy brought its own class of messengers. Envoys, diplomatic couriers, carried letters sealed with gold and wrapped in velvet. They were immune from attack by international agreement, but this immunity wasn't always respected. One envoy from England, carrying a peace proposal to France in 1423, disappeared along the road near When. The suspicion it was stolen and altered, because in medieval Europe, the right message at the wrong time could start a war or end one. The rise of printing in the 15th century began to shift everything. By the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe stood on the edge of a new postal age. Before maps carved up the Americas, before railroads or wires crisscrossed the land, a different kind of communication pulsed quietly through the forests, plains, mountains, and deserts of North America. There were no formal post offices, no royal seals, and yet messages traveled. They moved across rivers and ridges, and networked cities like Chaco Canyon, a central hub that flourished over 1,000 years ago, through canyons and over snowy passes, not in sacks of mail, but in runners' feet, smoke in the sky, and symbols etched in stone. Some roads were 30 feet wide, built not for carts or beasts of burden, but for people. Mounds, earthworks, and ceremonial centers were connected by well-traveled trails and rivers. This is the story of how Native American civilizations, rich in tradition, complex in governance, maintained communication across vast, diverse landscapes. Let us begin in the American Southwest, with the ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, who built vast cliff dwellings, each not, or be color-encoded treaties, declarations, or ancestral lineages. A single runner could carry a message from the Onondaga Council Fire to the Seneca Nation, without forgetting a word. Receiving such a belt meant you were being called to council. You were being asked to respond. Only trained messengers, often chiefs or elders, could deliver and interpret these belts, making them both documents and speakers. From Choco, roads radiated outward straight as arrows, etched into the desert, not through letters, but through people who remembered every word they were told to say. These runners would carry Kiva's commands, event notices, or ritual invitations across hundreds of miles, guided by natural landmarks and starlight. Composed of 5, later 6 nations, the Confederacy spanned hundreds of miles from modern-day New York into Canada. With the introduction of the horse in the 1600s brought by the Spanish, the speed of messaging increased drastically. They followed buffalo paths, river banks, and sun trails, paths that aligned with the position of the rising or setting sun. Historians believe these roads formed ceremonial routes, but they also carried runners who delivered messages to outlying settlements. One spark meant attention. To flashes, come. Complex messages could be strung together by pre-agreed sequences. A single puff might mean all is well. To might signal a return. They saw no written language, and so they assumed there was no communication. 3 could mean danger. Signals had to be read in context: the time of day, the color of smoke, the direction of the wind. Further east, the Mississippian culture centered in cities like Cahokia. Near present-day St. Louis had its own system. Canoes glided silently along the Mississippi and its tributaries, bearing messengers with wampum belts, beaded cords used not only as currency, but as records of agreements, events, and promises. Some became trade roads, others were paved into highways, and a few remained dirt trails tread quietly by hikers, never knowing they followed the same footsteps as messengers from centuries ago. Wampum wasn't just decorative, each pattern told a story. and to the north, among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Also known as the Iroquois, communication was treated as a sacred duty. They used a sophisticated network of trail systems like the Great Trailland relied heavily on. Runners who were trained not only in endurance but in memorized speech. Carved with clan symbols, they marked important places and communicated histories without a single word spoken aloud. In urgent times, such as war or disaster, a wall belt was dispatched woven with black and red beads to alert allies. And they did. From across forests and mountains, leaders gathered. On the plains, the Comanche, Sioux, and Cheyenne developed highly mobile communication systems. Yet even before horses, runners had connected the plains. And when runners weren't enough, they used smoke. Contrary to Hollywood tropes, smoke signals weren't random puffs. They were structured, coded, and location-specific. Further west, the Apache and Navajo used mirrors and reflected sunlight called heliographs to flash signals. Across canyons, every region had its rhythm. In the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit, Haida, and Salish used totem poles not just as art but as story posts. Down in the Great Basin and California, trails like the Mojave Trail and Cosa Range paths were walked by traders and envoys, carrying shells from the Pacific, salt from inland lakes, and messages of alliance and trade. When European colonists arrived, they often misunderstood these networks, but messages don't always need ink. They can be carried in feet, in beads, in smoke, in songs, in sacred memory. Many of these ancient paths are still visible today. The sun rises over a golden dome. Minarets cast long shadows. In the silence of the early morning, a messenger mounts his camel, scroll secured in a leather pouch, and begins a journey that may last weeks but not without order, not without purpose. Because in the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cairo, Cordoba to Samarkand, there was a system faster than one might expect. It was the nervous system of the Caliphate, and more advanced than most of Europe at the time. It was called the Bard. Its roots went back to earlier Persian models, especially the Sassanid Shapakone, but under the caliphs, it became a machine of astonishing precision. And it wasn't just a mail service. Let's begin with the Abbasid Caliphate, founded in the mid-8th century, with Baghdad as its glittering capital. Baghdad, in its prime, was a center of learning, trade, and science, a city where libraries bloomed and stars were mapped. But none of it could function. Without communication, these posts were operated by government officials, and only authorized messengers could pass through. And so, the Abbasids inherited and expanded the Bard, a state-run courier system that stretched across deserts, rivers, mountains, and empires. Who welcomed the messenger? Who seemed uneasy when the seal was shown? Another, Harun al-Rashid, made the Bard so efficient that no decision in Baghdad lacked awareness of the provinces. Each message delivered upward toward the capital carried not only content but context. Along the empire's major roads, spaced roughly a day's ride apart, were relay stations called Bard posts staffed with fresh camels, horses, food, water, and shelter. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad corresponded with translators in Alexandria, mathematicians in Damascus, and physicians in Nishapur. Some were diplomatic, some administrative. Others were scientific observations from astronomers, translations from scholars, reports from distant cities. A message might travel 500, even 1,000 miles in just a few days, an astonishing speed for the time. Each courier carried sealed letters written in Arabic or Persian script, rolled tightly and often protected in tubes of leather or metal. But they weren't just delivering mail, they were delivering intelligence. The Bard was also an espionage network. Couriers were instructed to observe the behavior of governors, report on local unrest, and even spy on military officials. Others were dispatched only for emergencies, bearing missives sealed with the caliph's signet ring, never to be opened by any other hand, their paths lit by moonlight, guided by stars, their journeys timed to sunrise prayers and call to prayer echoes bouncing across towns. Who delayed the mail? Nothing escaped the system, and in many Islamic cultures, orderly systems of delivery and message keeping are seen not just as practical but moral. One caliph, Al-Mutasim, was said to receive daily updates from as far away as Khorasan, in what is now Iran and Central Asia. It was a thread in the fabric of law, faith, science, and governance, a sign that knowledge mattered, and that distance was no excuse for ignorance. In Cordoba, letters traveled along paved Roman roads, connecting scholars across Muslim Spain and North Africa. Ibn Hazm, the great philosopher, once wrote of correspondence exchanged between lovers, nobles, and clerics, calling it a proof of both wit and heart. This was more than power. It was awareness, but it wasn't just the caliphs who benefited. But without a unified state, the reach of the bard slowly dimmed. Scholars, scientists, and poets relied on the bard to exchange letters, books, and ideas. Even merchants used parallel courier services to send contracts, and prices often piggybacking on the bard routes unofficially. And the couriers themselves? They were highly trained, often multilingual, trusted not only with speed, but with secrecy. Some were assigned permanent circuits. They rode camels for long desert stretches, horses for mountain passes, and even mules when terrain became treacherous, and they were respected. Couriers were known to carry rings of authority, and interfering with them was a grave crime seen as rebellion against the state. Later, under the Fatimids and Umayyads in Al-Andalus, the bard evolved. But even the bard was not eternal. With the fall of the Abbasid center during the Mongol invasions, the system fractured. Local rulers kept fragments alive. Yet, its echoes live on. Modern Arabic still uses the word bard for male, because in the golden age of Islam, a message wasn't just a letter. Across the wine-scoured plains of Asia, where the steppe rolls endlessly and the sky stretches like an ocean, a horse's hoof strikes the earth, then another, and another, a distant drumbeat growing louder. But this is not an army. This is the yam, and it's carrying the voice of Genghis Khan. At its height in the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of Eastern Europe, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. With conquest came chaos, but also something surprising: organization, efficiency, speed. Because Genghis Khan knew a truth many conquerors missed. Power without communication is nothing. So he built a network to match his empire. A web of messengers, stations, and royal permissions. It was called the yam from the Mongol word for checkpoint or post house. Think of it as the pony, expressed on an imperial scale. The system worked like this every 25 to 30 miles. Along key routes of the empire, a relay station was built. These were stocked with fresh horses, food, water, and shelter for messengers. When one ride arrived, another was ready to continue, just like passing a baton in a race. These relay stations could move a message over to 100 miles in a single day. A golden paisa meant the rider spoke with the authority of the Khan. To disobey such a courier was to risk execution. In a world before trains, before telegrams, before even most formal postal systems, this was like sending lightning across the land. The messengers, called arrow riders, were chosen for their skill, speed, and loyalty. They carried small, rolled scrolls tied tightly in leather, or sealed orders marked with the great Khan's Tamga, his imperial symbol. Messages moved between commanders. Orders leapt across borders, intelligence, military, political. Logistical flowed back to the capital with terrifying efficiency. But what made the system truly powerful was the pazer. With it, a messenger could demand a fresh horse, lodging, or even provisions from local villages, census reports, tax records, trade logs. Letters from administrators, all of it moved through the system. The pazer was a small, tablet-like passport issued by the Khan himself. It granted the bearer access to the yam stations. The pazer came in different ranks made of wood, silver, or gold, depending on the status of the bearer. Marco Polo himself marveled at the yam writing of palaces. For the post, eagle feathers that marked official riders. In deserts, they used camels. In snowy regions, even dog sleds, and a chain of stations more organized than anything in Christendom. Some pazer bore inscriptions like weathered signs, ruined outposts, oral tales passed down from herders who say, Here is where the rider changed horses. The yam made that possible, because every outpost was watched, every rider known, every road controlled. Whoever disrespects the bearer of this message disrespects Genghis Khan himself. The roads were sacred, horses were stolen, pazer were forged, some stations fell into ruin. The mail was law, and so the roads stayed open. Even in times of war, the yam kept running. But it wasn't just war. Genghis Khan was deeply interested in governance, and the yam was key to that. Even scientific knowledge traveled this way. In the later reign of Kublai Khan, the system connected Chinese engineers, Persian astronomers, and Italian envoys. To make the system more efficient, the Mongols built roads not paved, but beaten into the earth by thousands of hooves. Along rivers, messengers used boats, and when the terrain was dangerous, riders traveled in pairs, one to carry the message, the other to defend it. But the yam was also a system of control. By monitoring movement, the Mongol leadership could spot rebellion. A town that delayed a courier might be punished. A governor who falsified a message, executed. It was said that a virgin girl could walk from one end of the empire to the other wearing gold on her head and remain untouched. But as with all empires, time wore it down. With the decline of the Mongol Yuan dynasty and the fracturing of the empire into separate Khanates, the yam system broke apart. Corruption crept in, yet for a brief, blazing century, the yam was the fastest mail network on Earth, and even now, in the steppe regions of Mongolia, old tracks remain. And if you listen when the wind rises, you may still hear it, the thunder of hooves carrying the voice of a Khan across the edge of the world. For most of human history, sending a message was a privilege. A message could be a decree from a king, a secret passed between spies, or a prayer whispered across borders. Communication moved on legs, hooves, waves, and wind slow, perilous, and limited to the powerful few. Roads were repaired. Empires grew curious about order, trade, and surveillance, and the mail, once a royal weapon, was about to become something far greater, public. But in the shadows of these old empires, something quietly changed. As the Middle Ages waned, and the world slipped into the currents of early modernity, the world of messaging evolved. Trade surged, and with it came a simple need: letters, but shipping notices, price lists. This figure managed horse stations and routes, creating a skeletal postal highway stretching across the kingdom. Marriage proposals, a request for cloth from Bruges, an apology sent to a debtor in Frankfurt. Here, literacy rates were rising, and so was demand for communication. Local couriers, often on foot, connected towns and villages. Private individuals even began running unlicensed postal routes, sometimes faster than the government's own riders. If they refused to pay, the letter was destroyed, unread. You could deposit your letter for collection later that day. In some neighborhoods, messages could be delivered within hours, the ordinary stuff of life. Letters could carry not only romance and trade but also rebellion. Let us return to Europe. Sometime in the late 1400s, people didn't just want to read pamphlets. They wanted to write back. Scholars exchanged letters across borders. Poets and playwrights maintained epistolary friendships that lasted lifetimes. He introduced the world's first adhesive postage stamp in 1840, the penny, black. Many postal systems required letters to be opened and copied before delivery, creating early forms of state surveillance. But the mail could not be stopped. With papal approval, they organized a private courier network across Central Europe. Their mail moved faster and more reliably than any crowns. In rural towns, they became lifelines bringing news of births, deaths, and faraway children. Over time, this became a semi-public service paid by individuals trusted by princes. The Holy Roman Empire was sprawling and chaotic. Merchant cities rose in northern Italy, the Netherlands, and German lands. For the price of a stamp, the voice of a farmhand could reach a queen. A prisoner could write to a sister. A school teacher could send lessons across oceans, not declarations of war or sacred edicts. To solve this, a noble family stepped in, the Fern and Taxis dynasty. By the 1500s, Spain, France, and England began building state-run mail services, not just for royalty, but for government officials, diplomats, and very slowly for the literate elite. In England, by 1591, the Tudor crown had established a formal master of the posts, but it was still not for everyone. In the United States, the U.S. Postal Service evolved from colonial mail routes into a vast federal system, complete with pony riders, steamboat routes, and railroad sorting cars. In the early days, only the wealthy could afford postage, and the sender didn't always pay. It was the recipient who had to produce the coins. Still, the dream of universal connection had begun. By the 17th century, something remarkable stirred in the merchant cities of the Netherlands. Meanwhile, in Paris, street post boxes began appearing, and still, faster forces were gathering. With the invention of the printing press, paper and reading spread like wildfire. Governments began to worry. Censorship grew. It was becoming too necessary. Then came the 18th and 19th centuries, the golden age of transformation. Email, texts, voice notes. The message still moves, but the form is invisible. In Britain, a man named Rowland Hill proposed a revolutionary idea. That postage should be prepaid by the sender, not the receiver. For just 1 penny, anyone rich or poor could send a letter anywhere in the country. The mail was no longer just a tool of power. It became a human right across the world. Similar systems emerged. France, Germany, Russia, and Japan began building public postal networks organized by districts, timed deliveries, and fixed postage costs. Trains by the mid-1800s carried bags of letters across continents in hours instead of weeks. Mail carriers became national symbols. In cities, they wore crisp uniforms. A mailbox wasn't just a wooden box. It was a portal. And the postal service? It became one of the few truly egalitarian systems in the modern world. And behind every letter, a chain of invisible hands, the sorter hunched in a mailroom, the clerk stamping the seal, the carrier, boots wet with morning dew, walking 1 more mile, the train engineer, eyes fixed on the tracks, But perhaps what's most magical is that none of this was really new. Every layer of this modern system was built on the bones of ancient ones, the postal riders of Persia, the drum couriers of Africa, the camel networks of the Islamic caliphates, the Inca chasqui racing across stone steppes, the Mongol relay stations roaring with hooves, the memory of messengers who never wrote a word, but carried nations in their minds. In every letter you've ever sent or received is the echo of 1,000 messengers before you. And now, in the 21st century, mail has changed again. Digital messages fly through fiber cables, pinging across the globe in microseconds. Yet even now, we still send paper letters. We still line up at post offices. We still place postcards on dusty shelves. Because the need to reach someone really reached them remains. And whether that message is wrapped in papyrus, tied to a pigeon's leg, rolled in leather on a camel's back, or tucked into the side pouch of a postal carrier's bag, it always carries the same silent hope. I'm thinking of you. I am still here, are you? Thank you for staying with me across this long journey through history's slowest and most beautiful conversations. May these stories carry you gently to rest